All right, so I think we're live again. We had some. I messed up. I did not go back to the browser here. So I've been chatting with Aaron here about watching SCA. So Aaron watched the SCA for accepting payments on Stripe on YouTube, where I used Sinatra. But Aaron is using Rails and has shared a repository here with me where they are going through and creating these submissions where folks are submitting films and they're collecting payments for these films. So I just recorded like 20 minutes and went on and like built some of a Rails app, but I realized that like I wasn't actually sharing my screen. It was all like just me talking. So instead, I am like super optimized now for showing you what's actually going on the screen instead of just what's here. Also, before I forget, in this last thing, I was talking about how for Chris Sanchez, this was another question that came in. We got 2 questions this week about how to use Stripe with Rails. Chris Sanchez, again, sorry, I'm going to do without React this time, and we're going to do one-time payments with PaymentIntents, and then we'll come back in the next episode and do Rails with React. And yeah, if you haven't checked out the 100 Days of Code hashtag yet, super cool for new folks. So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about Stripe Elements and collecting and accepting a one-time payment with Stripe Elements using Ruby on Rails. And then later we'll do collecting payment with Stripe Checkout in Rails. And the big difference is that Stripe Elements is a set of form controls that you use to build your own HTML forms. And Stripe Checkout is a Stripe hosted page where you can redirect customers to collect one-time payments, accept these payment details in setup mode, or start recurring subscription. So Checkout is a little bit easier to implement. You offload a lot of regulatory requirement, addition of payment methods, localization, tons of stuff to Stripe if you use Stripe Checkout. If you use Stripe Elements, you build a lot of those forms yourself. So that's what we're going to do today, is build our own custom form to accept one of these things called a submission. And we're going to, so just going to kind of go through how to accept a one-time payment in an SCA friendly way. And I'm going to go through this best as I can here without too much, hopefully. Okay, so this is Aaron was kind enough to share his setup here. So what's going on is there is it's a Rails application, and there's a controller called submissions, and the submissions controller is receiving post requests, and it's creating a new submission model. This is a Rails database model. And then separately, it is setting the user and then calling save and charge. And save and charge is creating a Stripe charge object. And the Stripe charge object, once it's saved, everything is good. And then you can kind of like send your submission mailer. This is what I would call fulfillment. And so I'm glad this is the example, because there's a couple things that go into this. Number one, payment intents are asynchronous. And so we want to deal with, or they're not asynchronous, but we want to deal with the fulfillment in an asynchronous way by listening to webhooks rather than handling them synchronously just like this, because it's possible the user is going to confirm the payment intent, but then their browser might disconnect, or they might have a network connection error or something before coming back to your site. And so, or before you're able to handle that with JavaScript to tell your own application that it's successful. So we want to handle these fulfillment options with a webhook handler. So the very first thing I'm going to do is create a new Rails application. And it looks like this. I'm going to say, we're calling it accept a payment. I'm using -t to say skip tests, because I think by default you get mini test. I like RSpec, so I always do -t. Skip turbo links. Turbo links mess with JavaScript. It's like a way to like do PJAX where like only part of the page is loading. So I always skip that. Skip listen. I've run into weird issues where Rails console and Rails server won't start if I use listen. And then database is PostgreSQL. It doesn't really matter what you use for the database, but so that's the command that I'm using to install a new app. What I'm going to do is create a submission model. I'm also going to create a submissions controller. But before we do that, I'm going to first install some dependencies, get my API keys set up, et cetera, et cetera. So I hope that you can see this now. We'll jump to this view here. So if I say Let's do dependencies first. Install the Stripe gem. I like annotate. I also like pry Rails for when we're working in development mode. Okay, so then once those are created, I'm going to open up initializers, config, initializers. I'm going to make a new file called stripe.rb, and this is where I'm going to add my API key. Rails.application, credentials, stripe secret key. And I'll show you in a minute what setting my API keys looks like. So if I just go into here and I say editor is vi rails credentials : edit. This allows you to open the credentials editor here. And I'm going to say stripe secret key is this thing. Public key is this thing. And my web hook secret is this thing. Okay, so this is what the API keys look like. And so when I say rails.application.credentials, it accesses this encrypted credentials file. And then if I say .stripe, that's going to grab this object here. And now I can key into that with secret key, and that's going to pull out my secret key value. Okay, so that's the reason why I want to use an initializer over setting it in the model object is that when you set it in the initializer, it's loaded and available everywhere when Rails boots. So instead, this is kind of what was going on here in Aaron's submission database model, where we're calling save and charge. We were setting the API key here. Instead of doing it here in the model, I want to do it in an initializer. And also, instead of using charges are deprecated. So today we're using payment intents. It's going to work just a little bit differently. So what have we got going on here? Let's make a Rails new plus deps. This is going to be our Rails new plus our dependencies are installed. Rails G controller submissions, index, new. So I'm going to generate a controller with the index view and a new view. So that kind of jumps us into some, gives us a couple extra things. I love all the Rails generators and scaffolding and stuff. It makes things so quick to work with. So we're generating an index and a new view. Come on. I don't know what's hanging. Come on. All right, take a sip. I just got my new pair programming shirt today from Tuple. The Tuple hardware. It's pretty sweet. What is going on here? Why isn't this going? I'm drinking peach tea. Whoa, everything is, what's going on? Try again. What? I thought, yeah. What is going on? Spring, can I? Undefined method square bracket for nil class. Okay. So maybe I messed something up here. Credentials dot stripe. Did I not? Oh, I didn't close this. All right. So once I close that, now this should work now. I think Spring was like, I'm trying to boot up. I'm trying to boot up. I'm trying to boot up. And it wasn't telling us that it was failing because I had not saved that thing. So that credential didn't exist yet. Whatever. It's cool. All right. So now let's also Rails G model submission. It's going to have a title, a price, Stripe payment ID, and a status. For now, I'm going to just keep it just like this. In Aaron's application here, there's quite a bit more to the schema, but I'm going to leave that. I think those are all like, implementation details or part of the details of that business. So I'm just going to make the submission be a title, price, Stripe ID, and status. You can also think of this as an order or like an intent to buy something. intent to purchase something. So create submissions is our migration. Here's the model. If I say rake db drop db create db migrate, that should drop the old database that I created while we were doing the first version of this demo. It'll create a new database and it'll migrate and create these submissions. Okay. So in our routes file, we've got a couple things here. I'm just going to say resources submissions, and I'm going to say route to submissions index. Okay. So if we go to here, Rails S, so I'm going to start up my server, and it looks like it's going. Okay, cool. Localhost 3000, and cool. So here's our submissions index. That's great. All right, so submissions index, let's say we just want to make a link to /submission/new. Create a submission. Okay, this doesn't exist yet, so let's make a form there. Okay, new submission. Okay, so if we look at Aaron's form, I guess new.html sub new. Okay. At the top, we've got this film submission, $10, and this is using Simple Form 4. I don't know Simple Form 4 or the helpers for this, so I'm just going to write it from scratch with HTML. So it's a post request by default. We would be sending it to this /submissions thing. I know that Aaron's form, when you're using Simple Form, it creates an ID called new and underscore and then the thing. So I'm going to add that. Field. So we're going to add a field for the title. Wow, that was cool. Input text. The name is going to be submission title. And the ID doesn't, it does matter, I guess. Test submission. Okay, so we're getting close to being back to where we were before. All right, so we've got this form. Right now it has one input and it has a title. And if we click create submission, it's going to send a post request, a full page refresh back to Rails. It's going to post this data here that includes the authenticity token for CSRF checking and our submission title. But we don't actually want to submit yet, because first what we want to do is we want to add another form element here, which is where we're going to mount the Stripe.js element. So I'm going to call it card, just like Aaron's was called. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this an inline script tag. So on Aaron's form, we've got an inline script tag at the bottom here where we're initializing a new instance of Stripe. We're setting up some fonts, some styles. We're initializing a new instance of Stripe elements, creating the card element here. So we're creating an element of type card, passing in those styles so they match. And then we are mounting the card. Is it style or styles? The style object. Let's see. I thought it was styles. Oh, it's style. It totally is styles. Okay, cool. Before we do that, though, we need to go to application HTML ERB. So this is the kind of like the master layout or the base template or the kind of like the default ASPX or whatever kind of. This is the page where all the other templates are going to build off of. And so when we're using Stripe.js, we want to install it on every single page. So I'm adding that script tag at the top here. You can put it wherever you want. The only thing that matters is that Stripe.js is loaded before you try to use it. So because I'm loading it in the head, and this yield is where this template is being rendered on the left side. So all of this code is going to be rendered into where this yield block is. So because this code that I'm writing over here is in the yield block, and the yield block appears after the Stripe.js block. I can use Stripe.js just directly here. So I can install an instance of Stripe.js like this. Rails.application.credentials.stripe public key. I think this matches what Aaron has. And then I'm actually just going to copy what they've got for styles and fonts. Okay. And these, I think, are one space. Okay, cool. All right, so the next thing we need to do is initialize an instance of elements. And we called, okay. So this div with ID card, this ID equals card is the CSS selector that we're using when we mount the card element. Okay, so the hashtag, Octothorpe, whatever, refers to us working with the ID. And the fact that we're working with the ID and it's card means that we want to use this hashtag ID. That's the CSS selector to grab onto this card element. You cannot have multiple HTML elements on the page with the same ID. They have to be unique. And so, yeah, so we've got one card element and that should be good to go. Cool. So what's the next thing that we want to do? So on Aaron's page here, we're doing this basically kind of like following the same pattern up to now, right? And if we refresh the page, we should see a Stripe.js element here. And we do. This is the card number and the CVC, et cetera, et cetera. So this is actually the thing I didn't do that's different is styles. Refresh the page. Look at that. Okay, so we've got some cool looking style there. So this is loading I think it's a font from Google Fonts. And we can enter in our card number. Oh, okay. So maybe I should change the background. Let's see. Color. Let's see if that. No. Okay. Where is the color changing here? Page. All right. All right. So now we can see the card. Now we can see the card number. All right. So what's happening here, though, if we inspect this, is that the HTML element that has ID card is being populated and filled out by the Stripe element. And in fact, this is actually using an iframe so that for PCI compliance reasons, right? So if we click create submission at this point, we're going to send all the data that's in our form in valid form controls, not inside of iframes, is going to be sent to our server. But because we're using iframes for PCI compliance, we need to handle some of this with JavaScript. And what we want to do is we want to bundle up these card details. So the card number, CVC, expiry, postal code, et cetera, et cetera. We want to bundle those up, send them directly to Stripe. And then Stripe is going to respond to us on the client with a payment method object that is tokenized. We call this tokenization when you are taking some data, sending it on the front end, and you get back a token. This data should not hit your server if you want to depend on and offload your PCI compliance burden to Stripe into Stripe Elements. So, all right. So the next thing we need to do is actually create the payment method and confirm the payment intent. And so when the form is submitted, before we want to use JavaScript on the front end. So before it ever makes it to the server, we want to intercept that form submission and then do some stuff on the front end before we get back to your server. Okay, if we look at this accept a payment integration builder guide here, you'll notice that its recommendation. So this is on the official Stripe docs. If you go to the client.js, let's take a look. Client.js here, then you'll notice that on page load, we're making a fetch request to this create payment intent route. And this is kind of where Aaron's original question was. There is no create payment intent. Where is this coming from? This isn't really part of Rails. What is this actually doing? It's in the integration builder, it's happening on page load, but we don't want it to happen necessarily on page load. It's not required that it happens on page load. If you know the amount that you want to charge, if you know exactly how much you want to charge, cool. Go ahead, create the payment intent on page load. If, however, the form input, so if any input of your form is going to modify the cost, so it's going to modify the amount that you're charging, then you can also make this request to create the payment intent just in time. So right before the form is submitted to your server, after they click the button, but before it's submitted to your server, you can still make this fetch request to go create a payment intent. This is hitting your server. So this is a request to your server. So a post request is going to be sent to your server. Your server is going to make a post request to the Stripe API to create a payment intent. Stripe's API is going to respond with JSON to your server. Your server is then going to return some data about the payment intent that you created back to the client, and this promise here will resolve with an instance of a payment intent, or at least it'll have the client secret of the payment intent. So that's the important part. We want to create a payment intent with the amount that we want to charge, and then we need to use its client secret. So that's what we're going to do next. And I think what makes the most sense is actually to create a new controller called Payment Intents. Rails G model payment intents. Nope, not model, controller. Payment intents. And this is going to be a purely API controller. So like we're only going to receive post requests as JSON, and we're going to respond with JSON. Okay, so if we go to, there's probably some Rails magic thing that tells it that it's only an API controller and not an application controller. Not sure. I'm not sure it matters like a whole bunch, but if we say, let's make a create method, which is where we're going to receive post requests. And then here we can say like resources, payment intents. So this is us adding the route. So instead in the demo, it says create payment intent. That's the route that you hit to create a payment intent. You send a post request to that route. Here, by using resources, instead of create payment intent like this, the route is going to be payment underscore intents like that. We send a post request to this, and we should hit this create endpoint. So here what we want to do is create a payment intent with the expected amount, return the client secret. Okay, so here what we can do is say payment intent is equal to Stripe payment intent create. And at a minimum, this requires two things: an amount, which is the amount in cents, and the currency. You can also pass a whole bunch of other stuff. I think there's like a couple dozen. So if we look at the API reference for creating a payment intent here, you will see, switch this to Ruby. You'll see a whole bunch of different stuff that we can pass. So we need to pass amount. You see required, currency required. You can also pass confirm, a customer, description, metadata, off session. These are all like really common things. And then there's a bunch of even less common stuff. So for now, we're just going to pass the amount, the currency, and that's it. Okay, so we've got this endpoint that is hitting the Stripe API to create a payment intent. Again, we don't need to set our API key here because it was already set in an initializer, right? But we do need to make sure that we're returning the client secret back to the client. So I'm just going to say render JSON of payment intent. You can pass the entire payment intent back, or you could pass just, if you wanted, you could just pass like client secret. But I'm just going to render the entire payment intent. Let's make it just client secret. So we are going to render this JSON back. So if we, yes. Yeah, okay. I was trying to think about whether or not we want to prevent CSRF or skip CSRF checking. I'm going to leave it on and then actually use CSRF on the client. So we've got a new controller. It's called a payment intents controller. The only thing it does is create a payment intent. I passed in $10 here, right? Like, because I believe that here, if we go to submission, model submission, the charge that was being created before was using $10 as the amount and USD as the currency. Notice that we are not passing in the source or a statement descriptor or any of this. We definitely don't want to pass a source. We could pass description and statement descriptor, I believe. Let's see. Is statement descriptor? Yeah, we could pass a statement descriptor. Let's actually do the same thing. So statement descriptor is what did, okay, sure. Time sync. Okay, and then description order for, it looks like maybe a placeholder. So that's cool. All right, so you'll notice though that we're not passing a source. We're not passing any Stripe tokens. We're not passing anything that's actually going to collect payment. Right now, we're just creating the intent to pay. We're not actually creating the payment. Once we create the payment intent, we then need to confirm the payment intent. So that's going to be a future step. So what happens is back on our client, submit new, right? Here, we've got our elements all set up. They're all styled and everything. We want to say, I'm going to grab reference to the form, new submission. And when it's submitted, let's see, do that. Let's see. So when the form is submitted, we're going to make a post request to create payment intent, and then we're going to confirm create payment method and confirm payment intent. All right, so the first step here is we want to send a post request to payment intents, right, because that's the name of our route, that's the name of our controller, all of that matches. We're sending some JSON. And right now, the only thing that's going to be in the JSON is the form authenticity token. The reason we want to do this is so that we can prevent CSRF, so that someone outside of our application can't just start pummeling the create payment intent endpoint. So authenticity token is equal to form authenticity token. So this is like a Rails thing, but most web frameworks are going to have some concept of CSRF protection. Okay, so what's happening here is when the form is submitted, we are preventing default, which says don't actually submit everything to the server yet. Handle it with JavaScript. Then we're making a post request to create a payment intent. And then when this resolves successfully, this is going to be some data that's going to have a client secret. This is where the second step happens. So this is like kind of like step one. And this, we'll call this like step two. So we create the payment method and confirm the payment intent. And the way this works is we say stripe.confirm card payment. And the first argument here is the client secret of the payment intent. And the second argument is an object where we pass in the card element. Okay, so here, this card element that we created up above on, shows line 22 now. Card element here is an instance of a card element that we created with those styles before, right? So this card element is a JavaScript object. It's mounted in card and is rendering all of those controls for us to enter our card number, CVC, expiry, whatever. This card element, we want to pass reference to that as under the payment method card slot when we're confirming card payment. What this is going to do is confirm card payment will handle SCA for us. So this is going to do two things. This will, first, it will take our card element input. It will create a payment method. And then second, it's going to attempt to confirm that card payment. So when this promise resolves, if secure customer authentication was required, the user should have seen a modal where they were walked through SCA. If secure customer authentication was not required, they don't see anything. The payment intent gets confirmed, the payment method gets created, et cetera, et cetera. But either way, it's going to resolve with a promise, or this is returning a promise that will resolve with an object here. So say .then response, and the response will either have if resp.error, it'll have an error object with a message, or it'll have a payment, it'll have a payment method on that object. So what we want to do here is say, like, if there's a response.error, I don't know, do something to tell the user that something failed. Otherwise, in this case, we have like successfully created the payment and we can redirect or fully submit the form or whatever, right? So here, what I think we want to do is say like form.submit. But before we do that, we might want to embed the payment ID. So we'll call this step 3, embed payment ID in form. So I'm going to grab reference to like an input, payment ID input. And here we go. We're going to add a new field here. It's going to be another hidden field. And its ID, its name is going to be submission Stripe payment ID. And its ID is payment. And its value is nothing. So if we look back at submission, we haven't annotated. So notice that there's just like 2 lines here. You only see the class definition and this submission thing. So what we want to do is we want to annotate this so we can see what fields exist on submission. So I like using this tool called annotate. So you can say bundle exec annotate models. And that will annotate our models with comments, so that at the top now, we can see which fields are in the database and available. So I just wanted to confirm that this is actually called Stripe Payment ID. Sometimes I forget. So we go back to submission form. Okay, so back over here, we've got our payment ID. We've got this here set up. We grabbed reference to the payment ID input. Payment ID input.value is equal to, oh, I guess we don't actually have the payment resp.id. Let's go back to our payment intent controller and let's return the client secret and also the ID. Cool. So that should give us resp.id. The data that we're rendering as JSON here in the payment intents controller is what's available in data. We can actually call this maybe like, let's change this to be like a payment intent to make it a little bit more clear. And then down here, this becomes payment intent.id. Okay, so we are creating an instance of a payment intent, returning its client secret and its ID to the client. Then we're going to confirm and collect the payment on the client. We're going to submit our form. That's going to create a new submission that has a title and it has a Stripe payment ID. Let's give it a whirl. This was like a lot of moving parts, so I totally get if it's a little confusing. So on the new page, I'm going to add some breakpoints here in the browser console so that we can see that a little bit better. Okay, so what's happening now is when we submit the form, I'm going to add a breakpoint here just to make sure we're getting inside of the form handler. Then I'm going to add a breakpoint here to make sure that we created the payment intent successfully. Then I'll add a breakpoint here to see what happens afterwards. So we've got our test submission. I'm going to say ZC44. Okay, put in my test card number, click create submission. The form submission is stopped with prevent default. And now we're about to make a network request to /paymentintents to create our payment intent. We click play, we get down in here, we created this, we've got the ID of the payment intent. We've also got the client secret. This looks right. Okay, that is the client secret that we want. And now these details are going to be bundled up and sent to Stripe to tokenize and confirm that payment intent. So this client secret here is the client secret for the payment intent and is going to confirm it. And then if that's successful, then we'll enter into this then block. And at that point, we will have taken payment. So we will have taken payment. We won't even have a submission model yet in the database, but we will have taken payment. So I'm going to click play. so we got back a response object. It has a payment intent. If we scroll to the bottom, we see status is succeeded. So this payment intent is now successful. We've taken payment. We've entered into this block. Cool. We have this payment ID input where we're going to grab reference to the payment, to that hidden input, and we're going to set its value equal to this payment intent ID. And now we're submitting the form. Okay, so if we click play, unknown action, submissions. Okay, I didn't spell that right. All right, refresh the page. Nope, go back. Create a submission, test submission. So I'm going to use an SCA test card just so you can see what it looks like. We click create submission, opens a modal where then you can see what it would sort of feel like, again, in practice, when you're working with SCA. In production, this modal will be populated by the bank's sort of like secure customer authentication page, which will allow the customer to enter a one-time PIN or a password or log into their bank or whatever. So in test mode, we see this test 3D secure page where we can just click complete authentication. We enter into our success block and we submitted again to the wrong endpoint. Am I not spelling it right? Submissions, routes, submissions, post, sub. Oh, we just haven't defined it yet. Okay, so we're getting close. Let's see. How was the submissions controller defined over here? So in the submissions controller create method, we're creating a new instance of submission. With form params. See how those are defined. So we are going to expect, or we're going to require permission, and we're going to permit title and Stripe payment ID. Those are the only things that are coming in that we care about for our submission. And then what are we doing? So then if submission save, okay, we set the user, cool. So we say if at submission.save, else end. If submission was saved, then we want to like redirect to at submission. Else we want to render some errors and redirect them back to, actually, we probably want to like render new. Okay, so let me think through this a little bit here. So we've got this new submission. It has this Stripe payment ID. And we have a couple of actions here that we want to automate on, right? So yeah, because we won't have the ID of the submission in the, by this time, the payment was successful for sure, because we're not submitting the form until it's successfully resolved. So I think this stuff might be safe to do just directly in line here. So you might say something like this, right? Like send your emails right here. In practice, again, I think it's a little bit safer. So like what might happen is if you get to this point, like exactly right here, if the browser fails and you don't enter this success callback and you don't submit the form, then you may have a successful payment and no submission created. And so in order to add some safety rails around this, I might actually just send these as part of the webhook handler. Yeah, so let's see. If we go back here and refresh the page, we should be, okay, cool. Okay. Use submissions show to html.erb. Add the submission title. Okay, so we've got our test submission, and yeah, okay. So with the webhooks that are coming in, one way that we could solve this is wait and only process them after we have a submission with that payment intent ID filled in. Okay, let me think about this a little bit, but in the meantime, let's just put out like at submission.json. We have like some data to look at. So we've got the Stripe payment intent ID. We could retrieve this from Stripe. The status is null. Okay, we've got our created at, updated at, and we have this object. Okay, so couple of thoughts. I'm almost wondering if we want to create the submission. In this case, if we want to create the submission when we're creating the payment intent. So yeah, okay. So this is definitely one way that you could do it, right? I'm going to add a save point here. Create payment intent and submission separately. Okay. And then, right. Yeah, the reason why I'm hesitating is because watch. Let's take a look. So if we Rails G controller webhooks, I'm going to add a webhooks controller, and this webhooks controller is going to receive post requests directly from Stripe, and you don't want to verify authenticity token because it's a post request coming directly from Stripe. We want to say something like payload is actually, I'm just going to go to webhooks build, and under the check signatures Stripe documentation, we have an example here that's again written in Sinatra, but it should be fine, or it'll get us like pretty close. So we are reading the payload, and then our endpoint secret is stored again in Rails credentials. So rails.application.credentials Stripe webhook secret. This will verify the event that's coming in. So if the payment intent succeeds, what we kind of want to do is we want to look up the submission. Stripe payment ID is payment intent.id, right? Because event.data.object will be an instance of a payment intent. And the submission will have a payment intent ID also, but I think that we might receive this post request faster than we have a payment intent set up. So what I'm going to do is add a find by bang here so that this fails if we try to find a submission that doesn't have this payment intent ID, and then the webhook will be retried by Stripe. So Stripe is going to retry webhooks for us automatically. Submissions controller. If we don't respond with a 200, or if we don't respond with a 200xx HTTP response, then Stripe is going to retry. So if we receive the post request from Stripe with a payment intent succeeded event before we have the submission saved, because we get the post request for the webhook faster than we have the submission saved, then we will just fail and return with a 400 or something status code, because we're using find by bang, which should raise if we don't have a submission in the database with this ID. Otherwise, we should return status 200. So yeah, if I just say like render JSON message success. We don't care about this event type yet. I think this is where you want to do your submission mailer stuff and probably deliver later. And okay, let's put payment intent succeeded. Actually, let's put that above. And then let's say submission found at submission.name title. Okay, so how do we test this? How do we test this? You may wonder. Stripe CLI, so the Stripe command line. Oh, here it is. Stripe CLI is a tool for helping you build, test, and manage your Stripe integration right from the terminal, as the pitch says. And so what we're going to do is create a listener with Stripe Listen. So you can kind of see that here. This Stripe Listen command, super cool. That's going to set up a direct connection between Stripe and our local account. So if I say Stripe listen -- forward to localhost 3000/webhooks. I'm remembering that we may not have set this up in here. Yeah, resources, webhooks only create. So this says create a route for /webhooks that's going to go to that create action, and it only receives post requests. We don't want to list anything. We don't want to allow access for any other methods in here. We only want create. Okay, so now that we're listening, any event that happens on our Stripe account in terms of webhooks will be output here. So let's go back to the entire through the entire flow, or actually yeah, let's do it. So go back to submission/new and enter a card number. I'm just going to use 4242 for now. We create a submission, and then you'll see over here the payment intent was created. It succeeded. The charge succeeded. All of those are being posted directly to this webhook endpoint. If we look at the server log, we are seeing post requests come into this webhook. Let's see. So we received a post to the webhook endpoint for this event, and this event type is super hard to see in here. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, so payment intent succeeded. So yeah, okay, so here's our log. Submission found, test submission. Cool. And here is, okay, so here was the request here was the post request where we created the submission. Before that, before we created the post request for the submission, we did get an event, but it was of type payment intent created. So it's totally possible for this to happen where it would fail. Let's see if we can get it. Let's see if we can make it happen here where it fails. Oh, complete. And we should see some more events happen. Cool. Submission found. Okay, so what's happening here is it continues to find the submission. That's cool. We want to say at submission update status maybe to paid or something. And then we want to send these two emails, which I'm going to leave as an exercise for the reader. You can say like Rails G submission mailer and kind of like set up the submission stuff. And yeah, so I think this is roughly how I would build this. Yeah. Here I might say like render JSON signature verification failed. And then status 400. Same thing, but invalid JSON. Okay. And again, the reason that we use a webhook endpoint is so that if a submission, if the submission of a submission, if the submission of a submission, so if again, if the browser disconnects or there's a network disconnection between when the payment is confirmed and when this promise is resolved, if there's some sort of disconnect there, you want to be able to still fulfill the payment, which you can do when you receive those webhooks. You could also add some like other handling in the webhook to like look up the submission. If it doesn't find one, even after, 10 tries or something, then send you an email as the administrator to know like, okay, this thing is broken. So hopefully this was helpful. I'm going to put this code up on GitHub and share it, and then I'll just put a link in the description. Okay, cool. Hopefully this was helpful. I know I was like super rushing because in the last episode I had full screen. I had like the full screen face situation where I was just talking through stuff and I was showing things on screen, but I didn't realize that the screen wasn't shared. So I kind of called an audible, restarted. Hopefully this is okay. Thank you for watching. Please let me know if this answered your question. If it did not answer your question, I really want to like make sure that we're putting out good content that is helpful and that you're able to successfully build your business based on the stuff that we're putting out. So if this wasn't enough, or if you still have questions, let me know, and we can wind it back and roll it again. So, but yeah, I think I'm going to end there and wish you all, happy day, happy rest of your